Hi, I'm Maddie from Quilt Smart, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about our Mondo bag today. This is what the instructions look like. This is what one gridded interfacing looks like. And what you've got is some information on the back so that you can get your yardage. And inside you've got some great instructions. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through a few of the steps. The first thing that you're going to need to have is your interfacing. And you're going to cut it. I like to use the ruler and the cutter because it just gives a nice straight cutting line. And we're just going to cut like that and then cut along this line here. And no matter how your interfacing comes to you, if it's on this size of a panel or a wider panel, you're still going to cut out 4 rectangles. Okay, so that's kind of how that looks. And then keep in mind that you can have all kinds of different fabrics that you can use. So this one is the group that I'm going to use today. These are great because they're already cut in 2.5-inch squares. This would be a nice prettiness vintage one. And wouldn't this be great for a little diaper bag? And you can also use jelly rolls. So now we're going to go to the ironing board. And this is what we're going to end up with, is something like this, just from this to that. So I'll see you at the ironing board. Hi, so I'm at the ironing board just fusing my squares down, and I thought I'd show you a few of those. What you're going to do is just center those between the dotted lines. And the reason I say that is when you get 2.5-inch squares, they're not always 2.5 inches, and sometimes they might be pinked. So the goal is to just center them between the lines and then give a nice fuse. And I've already fused this, but I also like using an applique pressing sheet. It does, it holds the squares down too, so that's a nice tip to use when you're doing this. And the next step is going to be to sew them, to fold and sew. So I'll see you at the sewing machine. What we're going to do is simply fold on the dotted line, and we're going to stitch. I like to use a 1/4 inch foot, but there's a lot of ways to get a 1/4 inch, but you're just going to stitch with a regular quilting stitch 2.0 regular thread and a 1/4 inch foot, and just go right along the edge. So that's one row. Now one little tip is sometimes if you fold it, this can get caught, so don't do that. Always have your end out and fold again right on the line. If you had any overlapping, just still fold right on the line and stitch. And I like to do the short seams first, and that way it's all on your machine, not on your lap. And by the way, did I mention that you get perfect intersections with this method? That is the coolest part about it, and it's all staying together. As you can see, you don't have to sew 2 little pieces at a time. So it's a great method for that. And you just keep going, folding over to the next seam and stitching. Okay, this is all sewn, all the short rows, and now you simply clip at each on the dotted lines right there to the stitching. Now what that is going to do is the next step is going to be made much easier because you clipped, and you will see that in the next step. So I've clipped all these rows, and now some of the magic happens. We're just going to fold. One thing that you should note is at the end there's little arrows. So that one goes up, this one goes down. That means, and this is where you clipped, that's where you clipped right there. This one goes down and this one goes up. And if you manage that under your machine and stitch along, you can iron it first too. The instructions do say to iron it first, but you can do that if you wish. And I'm just going to restart that because I started a little too close to the edge there. And so you're just going to stitch along with that seam up and the one under it down, and do that for the whole row. And you're still folding right on the dotted edge, on the dotted line. And so you can see how, and my fingers can tell me, are telling me if that bottom seam is up or down. And this is where you get that absolute perfect matching. So what you're going to do is you're going to do each of those rows on all your rectangles. Okay, down to the finish line. Look at all the perfect matching on the squares. It's wonderful. This particular one, I've used different sort of color groups. You can do it scrappy, you can do patterns, whatever you want. But we're just going to finish the bag for right now. So, step 6 talks about making an L. And you've got your great instructions here that shows step 6. And do read the instructions too. I know we like to look at pictures, but read them too because there's a lot of extra hints and tips in there. So we're at step 6 right now, and we're going to sew this into an L. Now, you've got a top point on each of these pieces up here, and you've got what's called a bottom center. And the key is to match the bottom centers together. So you've got those two matched together. And then I'm just going to put those right sides together, and I'm going to stitch along this line so that the two bottom centers end up being together. And you'll see how the L is sewn together. And then when you take your next piece, this one I've already sewn together. Now this is where it might seem a little tricky, but it is so easy. You're turning one L upside down and you're matching it to this one. Now I've used the same fabric in all of my bottom centers, so I know right where they match. But that's what you're trying to do, is get your bottom centers to match, and then you're going to flip this one over to this. Again, make sure that those bottom centers match, and then you're going to sew right along this seam. Okay, so what we have is basically a little bit of a pinwheel here. This was the bottom centers that have come together here, going out towards the top point. So you also have an identical piece like this made with your lining. And what we're going to do next is sew this into the bag. And it's really quite simple. You're going to take one of the L's, and on the interfacing, of course, it's marked. On the lining, it won't be, but you're still going to sew one of the legs, if you will. You're going to fold right along this line and make it even with the raw edges of the other rectangle. And what I like to do is to flip it over like this so that I can sew it under the sewing machine like this. And I start at that bottom area and go right down toward the top, right to the edge here. And you're just going to be matching these up, nesting those seams together as you go. And you're going to do that for this part, for the outside of the bag, on all 4 sides. Don't worry if you get to the last one, it feels not quite right. It'll turn out great. And then you're going to do the exact same thing to your lining. And when you do that to the lining, what you're going to end up with is this. So you can see how that bag has been formed. I'll show you in just a minute how you put those pieces together. Here's our bag. It's all stitched together just like the lining is. Now look at the bag. It's all floppy, but I want my bag to stand up really nice and firm. So I've got by Annie's Soft and Stable Inside, and I love that product. You'll also notice I have a slit here. That's for the opening to turn, which we're going to do at the last step. So you've got your lining here and you've got your bag here, and you take your handles and you position them on the bag. There's little marks. That's one of the really cool things about the interfacing, and I just like to put a pin. So I've got a handle there and a handle there and 2 more over here. And I also have the key strap in there. There's also a mark for the key strap. Okay, so I am just turning this out when I just kind of pull the handles like this, turning it right side out through that opening, and then put the lining back in. I like to finger press it and all first before I sew that opening up, and I usually do that by hand after the whole bag is made. And I push out the corners here to the bag, and this is when you get a real nice glimpse of what your bag's going to look like. So pretty and springy, and there you go. And you can see how nicely it'll stand up. Obviously have a little bit of finger pressing to do, and I take the corners and just kind of work with them, the little inside points there, and I finger press a little bit, and then I am going to go through and top stitch all around the edges. So that is our Mondo bag. Here's what the instructions look like. There's lots of great hints and tips in there, and I hope you enjoy making that. Have a great day.